Let's pay a visit to Mark's True Crime Corner.
This is not a good neighborhood. I'm scared.
Now, here's your host, Mark Thompson.
Or Kim McAllister in for Mark Thompson. Hey, it's good to see you, Courtney. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am
so nice
good.
to catch up.
Well, thank you for coming in today. And I don't know exactly what you'll be talking about, but I know that you've worked really hard on it. So what have you drummed up for us today?
I have. It's interesting. I came across this story and I was not familiar with this story. So I thought I would cover it today, which is the Bre-X gold scam. Are you familiar with this story?
No, not at all. I can't wait to hear about it.
It's fascinating, and it started really in the late 80s, but actually really happened like mid 90s. And I can't remember how I came across this story, but it was really fantastic. So the program that I listened to features this woman who's the host, Suzanne Wilton. It was produced by the CBC and the BBC because the story takes place in St. Paul, a small town outside of Alberta, Canada, which is St. Paul. And the whole series that I was listening to starts with this man who's in a helicopter, and his name is Michael de Guzman, and he's flying to a mine site that he's been working on for several years. And as he's flying to this mine site, he's in this helicopter that he's taken hundreds of times, if not more, over the last several years and working at this mine site. He's a geologist who's working with a business partner out of Canada. And he gets into the helicopter, and it's a different pilot who's piloting this helicopter. And there's another person in the helicopter who he's not familiar with. And the helicopter takes off. And shortly after takeoff, the pilot feels a loud sort of whoosh and an influx of air in the cabin. And he looks behind him, and Michael de Guzman is gone. And so there's some questions around whether or not he committed suicide or he was murdered or if it was an accident. But I'll get into all of that with this story. But it's a fascinating story. And it took place, as I mentioned, in the mid 90s. And it started out with this penny stock and this very small mining company out of Canada. And it ended up reaching a $6 billion market cap, which is why they call it the $6 billion gold scam. So Michael de Guzman is a geologist. He is from the Philippines, and he spent a lot of his career as an engineer and a geologist, but really had not found a lot of success. And he had been on several mining sites throughout his career, but he connects with a man named John Felderhoff in the late 80s. I think it was like 1987. And so they joined forces to look at several mining camps and locations in Borneo, in Indonesia. And they find a particular spot, and John Felderhoff knows a mining executive who has this very small company in Canada, and his name is David Walsh. And so John Felderhoff goes to David Walsh, who has incorporated this small company called Bre-X Minerals with his wife, and they tell him that some initial finds in this area in Borneo, that there might be gold, and that John Felderhoff has been working with this geologist and engineer, as I mentioned, Michael de Guzman. And so David Walsh comes up with $200,000 or $250,000 to start the permitting, to have access to the site, and to do all the payoffs that needed to happen to work in Indonesia with the president, whose name is Suharto. And so they start this, and they get permitting to work at this spot in Borneo in like 1993. So you can see there where this Busong mining site was in Borneo. Now, it is said that Michael de Guzman has a dream. And in this dream, he figures out that there is gold in this particular area of Borneo. And in fact, when they start to mine that area, they start to come up with gold. And it turns out that original findings and reportings of the area, that this is one of the richest gold mines in the world and historically. And so they start to raise money to continue to mine the area. And so they're raising money mainly in Canada. And actually, St. Paul is this very tiny community outside of Alberta, Canada. And it was said that 1 in 26 people in the city were buying stock of Bre-X, because it was sort of getting around the city that they had this huge gold find, and that there were several, new millionaires in this little tiny enclave of people buying up the stock.
Okay, so this is suspicious. Right?
And when the stock was the stock was originally a penny stock, but it climbed to a value of, I think, like $285 something. So it was crazy. It was doing incredibly well. It was being traded in the Toronto Stock Exchange, but I also think it was traded on the New York Stock Exchange. But many people were millionaires overnight. And eventually, they raise all this money, they're mining this area, and they have to renegotiate their permitting with the Indonesian president. And so they start to renegotiate, but now other firms are coming in. So there's a slide kind of a little bit lower, Tony, and several other mining companies come in and kind of pitch this business and are working to ingratiate themselves with President Suharto. A lot of it had to do with hiring his family members. So his family members were working for all these different mining companies. But in the end, when they were doing that, these third-party new mining companies brought in auditors to look at the reports and look at the gold that was being found and reported at these specific sites. And in the findings of these new auditors, here we go, Freeport is one of the US companies that came in and negotiated a pretty large ownership of this permit to mine this area in Borneo. And the auditor, if you go down one, I think, the auditor comes in for Freeport. And what had been happening is Michael de Guzman would find time to be alone with the samples that were being mined. And he was actually shaving off the gold from his wedding ring and putting it into the samples that were coming in.
Lies.
For years. And he eventually ran out of gold in his wedding ring. So now he was buying gold nuggets from the people who were mining, from the native people from that area who were mining that gold in the river surrounding this area. He was buying gold nuggets from them, and he was putting it into these gold samplings.
That is crazy.
The auditor.
Like, how sustainable is that? It can't possibly, he knows he's going to get found out sooner or later.
Right. And then that brings us to the helicopter. But yes, I mean, there was, I don't think, any long-term planning in this. And I think he got way ahead of himself, because you're right, there was no sustainability around this. And maybe it comes without question that eventually the negotiation of these permits would in fact come up, because they were only permitted for a year. And so third parties would come in, and bring people to look at the samplings and the reporting, which was erroneous. And one of the auditors talked about like the shape of the gold. So based on where they were mining the gold, it should have been more like shaved gold, and some of the gold felt more like nuggets. And so at the time, Michael de Guzman kind of talked about this theory called volcano pool, which is essentially like, because there were volcanoes in the area and volcanoes eventually would implode on themselves, the heat and the pressure in that happening would change the shape and the makeup of the gold.
And as a geologist, he ought to have known that. Meanwhile, he's going home and his wife's like, hey, where's your wedding ring, pal? What's going on?
Exactly. Well, Michael de Guzman also had 4 wives. Exactly. And
at the same time?
None of them knew about each other. Exactly.
He had four wives at the same time?
Yes, yes, he was busy. And
He's
he
not
had
a
these four
sympathetic character,
wives.
Courtney, I have to tell
Yeah,
you.
I know. But whatever ring it was for whatever betrothed woman he had, that ring eventually, you're right, was what went away. And so in the findings of these reports, that was eventually reported back to Canada. In January of 1997, this is all coming to a head. And there is a fire, in quotes,
Oh,
at the headquarters of the Bre-X minerals camp in Borneo. So it is alleged that Michael de Guzman set that camp on fire, that headquarters, and everything was lost in that fire. And again, that's January 1997. And in March of 1997, in fact, March 19th, that is when Michael de Guzman boards the helicopter from one of the main cities in Manila, or in Borneo, and takes that helicopter to the mining site. And that is in fact when he leaves the helicopter, whether by choice or otherwise. And this shot on the right is just a shot of the helicopter, from the year prior. When he exits the helicopter, whether by choice or not, he is found 4 days later in the jungle. So Michael de Guzman's body, or a body, is found in the jungle. Now, what's really interesting about the body is, and I don't want to get too graphic, but there is no face, there are no hands, and there are no feet. So
interesting.
And only one person ever identified him.
How obvious can it be? I mean, how do you mysteriously lose a face and any fingerprints? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. And his wife, one of them, her name is Jeannie, Michael de Guzman's wife, said that Michael de Guzman did not have any real teeth, but part of the identification process was alleged to have come from his dental records, and that he had teeth intact. So who is to say what happened? I don't want to go too far down the conspiracy theorist, but it is a very interesting and unfortunate end to this story. Now, he did leave a suicide note, but as I mentioned before, it was not the same pilot. There was a mechanic to help with any mechanical issues that was on the helicopter, who had never ridden with him before, and in fact, he passes away. The two other people in this story are John Felderhoff and David Walsh. David Walsh leaves Canada. He moves away. I believe he was in the Bahamas, and he dies of a brain aneurysm, I think in like his mid-50s. And then John Felderhoff died just in the last couple of years. This is David Walsh. He was actually robbed in the Bahamas. Several people entered his house masked, took all of his money, and he did not die from that. He died later, days later, from a heart attack.
Wow.
And then John Felderhoff passed away, I believe in like 2019, 2020. He lived in Indonesia for the rest of his life after this happened. Now, unfortunately, all of these men sold their stock before the big crash. So they all made a lot of money. In fact, I think it said that John Felderhoff made $87 million off of the stock prices for Bre-X. I watched a movie that was inspired by this story called Gold. It was it was fine.
That's got Matthew McConaughey in it.
Yeah, I mean, they managed to make him look not like Matthew McConaughey. Mm-hmm. He looks like a mining executive, but it's interesting because this story is based on this movie is based on this story. And in fact, Michael McConaughey's character is named Kenny Wells, but originally he was Kenny Walsh after David Walsh. But for some reason, the makers of this film decided to distance themselves from the story. So they changed the names and changed some of the storyline, which is a little bizarre because the story in and of itself is awful, but it could potentially make for an interesting Hollywood film. So it's unclear to me why they wanted to distance themselves from this story, but it's an interesting movie. It was made by the Weinstein Company too, which is not a production company. I see that often. But yeah, it's a fascinating story. And it certainly is surprising that they were able to pull that off in the mid 90s. So
Maud says, I can't find any sympathy for these people.
I know.
No.
Exactly. I know. It's awful. I mean, a lot of people lost a lot of money, a lot of institutions too that put money into the stock. Because as I mentioned before, it's a small, very close community in this rural town in Canada. So word got out pretty quickly that you could buy the Bre-X stock, and people were finding great wealth very fast.
So do we think the geologist is somewhere in the world living out his life with quadrillions of dollars and new wives?
I know. I mean, it's hard. I try to avoid conspiracy theorists, but it's hard not to think about everything that went into creating a way by which he would either be murdered, fake his own death, or suicide, right? Like there had to be components where certain people who would regularly be with him on that helicopter wouldn't be there to report or, be able to intervene with whatever was happening. This is actually a picture of the crew, and you can see John Felderhoff and Michael de Guzman there in the middle. But yeah, I don't know. Who knows? It's alleged that certain communications have come from Michael de Guzman since the alleged suicide or murder, but I don't know. Yeah.
Kathleen Bryant wants to know, what about the DNA?
That's a good question. I mean, I think because it happened in Indonesia, I don't want to make any.
They don't have a lab? I don't know.
I just don't know what the process is. I don't know if they kept the DNA. I'm not sure if what their process is of finding and investigating it. And maybe there's enough payoff that it doesn't, you know what I mean? They're fine with whatever's happened.
Do you think the movie kind of matches the intrigue of the story you just told? Does it do a good job?
Yeah, I mean, they have. It's interesting. They took a bit of the liberties with it, and they kind of Hollywoodized it. like Matthew McConaughey he has an issue with his marriage and a drinking problem, like kind of the things that Hollywood puts in to create, conflict and challenge, when the story in and of itself has enough. Right. But I thought it was interesting. They definitely changed certain things within the story. And so, but certainly they do. I mean, if you were to believe the story for face value, very much Michael de Guzman is the only person that knew about any of the misrepresentation in the reports, the lying and the use of the gold on the ring and the mined gold from the prospectors who are prospecting in the rivers that surrounded that mining area. But I don't know. I mean, it would be hard to imagine that John Felderhoff and David Walsh, being geologists and engineers and mining executives in and of themselves, didn't have any idea of what was happening in the falsification of the records. So there's an interesting story. There was only one interview that David Walsh ever gave about what was happening with Bre-X, and this was in 1997, earlier part of 1997, where he really does go on to just talk about this really amazing, unlikely finding of gold, this mini gold rush that they had come across as a company, and really sort of denying that there was any kind of mishandling or misrepresentation of what they had found. So
it's a wild story. Courtney, you've done it again. Wow.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. Yeah, it is a crazy story. It really is. I cannot believe that it was able to happen in the mid 90s, but it was. The series is available. It's really great. The series is available to listen as a podcast. So anyone interested.
That's on the CBC?
Yeah. Okay. I think you can get it wherever you listen to your podcast, but it's produced by the CBC and the BBC. Yeah.
And it's called the $6 billion gold scam.
The $6 billion gold scam. Yeah.
Wow. Courtney, thank you so much for coming on, even though Mark's not here.
Oh, I like it better.
Well, girls are going to be running the world soon anyway, so we might as well start now, right?
No, you're always so sweet to have me.
Yeah.
And so thank you. Thank you for always inviting me when he's not on.
Thank you for taking the time to research the story and get all the pictures together and come on with it. Hope to see you next Monday as well.
Yes. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, Courtney. And that is True Crime Corner.
True Crime Corner, only on The Mark Thompson Show.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.